Good morning. Today's podcast is a story of my grandpa's mother's experience in World War II. During this interview, expect to get an insight on how his mother, named Jana Kaderli, helped to resist the Nazis and German soldiers and contribute to the war effort in Czechoslovakia. I hope you enjoy.
What kind of education did your mother get, and what was her occupation as an adult?
She graduated from medical school in 1938. She did what today is called internship. So she was an internal medicine doctor, or general medicine doctor, but she was an internist. And she was working in her internship, and they had lots of demonstration, boycotting, and all that. And the important date here is November 17, 1939, and this was her first brush with, I would say, life.
What was the first steps that the Germans took when they occupied Czechoslovakia?
They closed all the universities, Czech universities, and students protested that, okay? And there were a number of them were killed, a number of them were sent to concentration camp, and from that point, this is known as the International Students' Day, and this is at Charles University, that's where it is. And my mother and father both were involved in organizing these protests, okay? Now, they had a good luck because they were already not students, so they were not living in dorms and all that.
Yes.
They didn't get them, right? She was working in the hospital, and so was my dad, right? So that went out okay. So they had these actions going on all the time. So, but this was a kind of not a really shooting actions. They were, doing boycotting of public transport, for example. They were doing protestation. They were doing sabotage in the factories. They organized, for example, in Czech factories, they were making German armament, so they sabotaged the production. They put sand in the machine guns, so they they were unusable. So there was a kind of I would say, passive resistance. Okay.
What events followed the protests that were occurring in Czechoslovakia?
1942, there was an important date, May 1942, when there were lots of Czech soldiers and pilots and all that. They went to England to fight with England and France against Germany, and so there were a group of Czech soldiers who were trained as assassins. And in 1942, they were sent from England by parachutes to Czechoslovakia to assassinate this Reinhard Heydrich. He was one of the main authors, for Holocaust. So he was one of the first ones and important ones. And what happened is, upon his arrival in Prague here, he wanted to kill the Czech culture and members of Czech resistance. What my parents were. So he was ambushed by those commandos that were Czech and Slovak soldiers that parachuted from England and were dropped in Czech Republic, and they waited until they found a proper opportunity to get this guy, because he was seen as a next to Hitler, really. So he would have replaced Hitler eventually. He was a very ruthless, ugly guy.
How long did your parents manage to stay in Prague?
It's just impossible for my mother and my parents to stay in Prague. So we had to go and live in the country because they were killing people right and left. They razed to ground 2 villages as a revenge.
What made it especially hard to stay in Prague?
It was impossible to live in Prague because they were looking for everybody for them. So they would have been shot, or they've been deported to concentration camp or something. So they just... And this lasted for about 2 years. So we lived there about 2 years until about 1944.
Do you remember what year you came back from the countryside and came back into Prague?
I can't know, but then I remember pretty much. I remember coming back to Prague. I remember living, and then the shooting war started. You know, Germany started to lose, and there were people who were emboldened in Czechoslovakia, so they started doing assassinations, you know, shooting at soldiers, all that. And I remember that we had several visits by, I don't know who they were, but they were Germans, you know, looking through our house, looking for my parents, but you know, they were hiding somewhere else always. And this conflict has escalated in May of 1945 to, you know, open warfare. So then, you know, they were on one side, it was a Czech resistance, on the other side was a German army, and they were shooting at each other.
How did your family personally get involved with the conflict that was happening?
At that point, both of my parents were involved, and my mother, as a physician, she was trying to tend to those wounded ones. And what I said to your dad always, I remember that she had you know, it was like a suburbs, and there were fences between the houses, and so that she doesn't expose herself to fire. She had to travel through the garden, so she had a ladder, and she, you know, was going over the fences onto the other house, another house, another house to reach somebody. So she traveled like that, not on the road, on the street. So that I remember quite well.
Do you remember any specific events that happened after the conflict?
Eventually, eventually Czechoslovakia became liberated. It was partially by allies, but they didn't go all the way to Prague. They were all the way to Pilsen. And the Russian army came through Prague. So this was in May 9, 1949, when, for us anyway, the war ended. Allied liberation of the other part of the country. So there was a demarcation line. A western part of Czechoslovakia was liberated by U.S. Army, let's say, but the capital was liberated by Russian or Soviet Army then.
What would happen if you came across a German soldier or a Nazi?
They put stamps where you work, so when the inspection comes, you have to show it that you are employed. If you are not, you are suspect. After 1939, when she was 2 years in her internship, she switched the job so that it allows her to have more flexible hours or something like that, so she can be involved in these activities, and she's not suspect. And she worked for an insurance company to see if the people are fit for insurance. So that says here. And then, of course, you know, after she had to go in the country, she was in and out.
What were the key events that led your family into this situation?
So you have got the 1938 Munich start of a resistance that led eventually to this student uprising where she was very much involved. Then then they did the boycotting, and they did sabotaging of the factories. That's what most of my dad, though, really, but she helped. And then you've got a Heydrich assassination. Everybody had to clear because they would lose their life. And then in 44, 45, there was an activity as a doctor, you know, tending to injured people during that war effort.
How much was your community affected by the war?
Well, terrible. Yeah, it was, well, community was affected, was destroyed. It was, first of all, it was, you know, but people were scared. People didn't talk. Social life almost vanished. Everything was Germanized. As I told you, community, the universities were shut down. Higher education, you can put that down, that's important. And it goes with this, you know, everything was bilingual.
Do you know German?
No, I know a little bit. I can get by, but I can't speak it fluently.
How much of your community left to the countryside?
Well, I know of my, for a period of about 2 years, I would say not immediately, but after that assassination, yes, I would say, the actively engaged people in resistance almost all left. And that was the one problem, because after Heydrich assassination, they almost wiped out all the resistance for at least 2 years, until 44.
What did you primarily eat during this time?
I can't tell you. I can tell you I had no toys, zilch. My first toy was Jeep, which is in Austin, that parents bought me in 1945 after war ended. I do know that I had some nuts. We had to live in a basement because of bombardment. And so I had some snacks and nuts that I remember, because we always found the crumbs in the bed, and I hated that. But there was a food. There was not like we were starved.
How old were you when Czechoslovakia was liberated?
6. 5. 5.
And then how old were you when it started? Or like,
I was born in 1941.
okay. And then when you were invaded, did you live in Prague?
Yes.
And then what part of the countryside did you go to when you...
This one I showed you, it is about 50 miles west of Prague.
Okay.
You can show the picture.
Okay. Did you ever have a personal encounter with a Nazi soldier?
Yes, several. 1945, 1944, 1945. And then as prisoners too. They were taken prisoners of war and they were repairing roads. So both ways. Nazi, I don't know if everybody was a member of Nazi. They had soldiers, and these soldiers had to do what they were told. They may not have been Nazis. So you have to differentiate between Germans and Nazis. But I did have a contact with Nazis. But make sure that people understand that not all Germans were Nazis. They may have done it against their, they were just the soldiers. So there were, on the other hand, there were so many willing participants and so many Nazis that, it was real bad.
How could you tell the difference between a Nazi and a German soldier?
I wouldn't be able to unless I talked to them, and I wasn't able to conduct a conversation with them. I could say that definitely if there was an officer or SS, this is a special unit, SS unit, which they came, that they had to be Nazis by definition.
Did your mother speak German?
Yes.
She did. Did your father?
Yes.
Thanks for listening to this week's podcast. I hope you learned more of how civilians were affected by this global conflict and found Jana Katterly and my grandpa's experience at a young age very interesting.